Well, hello there, folks. It's that time again where I read a story to the nation. Not sure nation is the right word. Thank you for tuning back in. Guys, the support I've been getting is quite overwhelming, as I've said before. So thank you very, very much for that. It is very humbling. So the vote went along the lines of Roald Dahl, Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. So that's what I'm going to read this week. I've broken up the book into fifths, and so we're going to aim to read 6 chapters. There are 30 chapters, so we're going to aim to read 6 chapters a night. And that should keep us busy for the week. So that's cool. Hello guys. Hi Jacob. Hi Elliot. Hi Tracy. Good to see you. I say see you. It's good for you to see me, I suppose. It's been a very long time. So yeah, so I'm going to wait a couple of minutes just to let people sort of join and get in, and then we'll start reading Charlie and the Chocolate Factory together. The reason why I keep on waiting, hi Rachel, the reason why I keep on waiting is just so that people don't jump in halfway through, and then if you jump halfway through, then obviously you might have missed a bit that, you know, you get it. So yeah, I've never read this. Never read this book. I've seen the film, but I've never read this book. So I'm quite excited to see how the book matches with the film. I think I've read maybe a chapter or two, but it's not in my memory that I read it. So I'm quite excited to see how that goes. So yeah, don't forget to like and share the page if you haven't done already. The page is growing massively, which is amazing. We've had, I think we're up to about 550-ish likes, I think, which is amazing considering when we started 2 weeks ago. Although I've done three stories, I think, 3 or 4 stories. Excuse me. Oh. Yeah, it's grown really well, which is amazing. So keep on sharing, keep on those likes coming. My mailbox is constantly getting I'm constantly getting messages about the reading competition, writing competition. God, I'm not with it today, am I? The writing competition. So please, you know, if you've got any children, or you know you've got cousins or anything like that, please get them to take part. It's building up to be something quite nice, quite special. And like I said at the start when I was thinking about the competition, it's to give those children a purpose to read and a purpose to write, because we know that obviously children are sitting at home, they are probably getting work for home, probably getting work sent home from school, whatever, but there's no real meaning or context to it. So I'm trying to provide those children with a bit of a meaning, a bit of a context to whatever they're doing. So it's trying to promote a nice, positive feeling for the hard work that they're going to do, rather than just do a bit of work and no one's actually looking at it or checking it. So that's really, really important, I think, especially in the current climate. I think it's important children still feel valued, particularly with the work that they're doing. So yeah. I'm going to share the page. Zoe, is sharing the page to a couple of pages. Elliot, nice. Enjoyed the glass experiment. Have you got any if you've got any photos, don't forget to email me because I can put them on our school website if you want to. Glass experiment. I'm trying to work out what that is. Maybe you can type and I'll read it as I multitask. So yeah, please just keep on checking back. Let's keep this going. I've been thinking about how long I can legally do this. I can't infinitely read all of these. I can't keep reading Roald Dahl books. It's probably against the law, to be fair. So what I will do though is I'll probably email the publisher, Puffin, just to check that, just to let them know that I've done it, just so I can kind of cover myself a little bit. What I have been doing in the meantime though is finding lots of children's books that I can read in the public domain. So things like Alice in Wonderland, everyone can read that. That's something that's in the public domain. I think it's because it's been written hundreds and hundreds of years ago. So so it's something I can read. Whereas if you look at something that Roald Dahl, it's still in publication. And yeah, there's kind of a legality around that. But that's a bit boring for you children. So he's having a go. Well, he can probably already do the spellings, to be fair. He's very good at spellings. I imagine he's got most of them right already. Anyway, let's start. It's 7:05. It's a slightly bigger book than what did we read last? We read George's Marvellous Medicine, didn't we? So there's a bit of a difference. George's Marvellous Medicine there. Bit of a difference. So we shouldn't finish early on this one, which is good. 1. Here Comes Charlie. These two very old people that are father and mother of Mr. Bucket. Their names are Grandpa Joe and Grandpa Josephine. And these two very old people are the father and mother of Mrs. Bucket. Their names are Grandpa George and Grandpa Georgina. This is Mr. Bucket. This is Mrs. Bucket. Mr. and Mrs. Bucket have a small boy whose name is Charlie Bucket. Some cracking illustrations by Quentin Blake again. This is Charlie. How do you do? And how do you do? And how do you do again? He is pleased to meet you. Then we've got Charlie. We just love Quentin Blake's drawings. Simple but brilliant. The whole of this family, the 6 grown-ups, you can count them, and little Charlie Bucket, lived together in a small wooden house on the edge of a great town. The house wasn't nearly large enough for so many people, and life was extremely uncomfortable for them all. There were only 2 rooms in the place altogether, and there was only 1 bed. The bed was given to 4 old grandparents because they were so old and tired. They were so tired they never got out of it. Grandpa Joe and Grandpa Josephine on this side, Grandpa George and Grandma Georgina on this side, Mr. and Mrs. Bucket and little Charlie Bucket slept in the other room upon a mattress on the floor. In the summertime this wasn't too bad, but in the winter freezing cold drafts blew across the floor all night long, and it was awful. There wasn't any question of them being able to buy a bigger house, or even 1 more bed to sleep in. They were far too poor for that. Mr. Bucket was the only person in the family with a job. He worked in a toothpaste factory, where he sat all day long at a bench and screwed the little caps onto the tops of the tubes of the toothpaste. After the tubes had been filled, of course. But a toothpaste cap screwer is never paid very much money, and poor Mr. Bucket, however hard he worked, and however fast he screwed on the caps, was never able to make enough money to buy one half of the things that so large a family needed. There wasn't even enough money to buy proper food for them all. The only meals they could afford were bread and margarine for breakfast, boiled potatoes and cabbage for lunch, and cabbage soup for supper. Sundays were a bit better. They all looked forward to Sundays because then, although they had exactly the same, everyone was allowed a second helping. The Buckets, of course, didn't starve, but every one of them, the 2 old grandfathers, the 2 old grandmothers, Charlie's father, Charlie's mother, and especially little Charlie himself, went about from morning till night with a horrible empty feeling in their tummies. Charlie felt it worst of all, and although his father and mother often went without their own share of lunch or supper so that they could give it to him, it still wasn't nearly enough for a growing boy. He desperately wanted something more filling and satisfying than cabbage and cabbage soup. The one thing he longed for more than anything was chocolate. Walking to school in the mornings, Charlie could see great slabs of chocolate piled high up in the shop windows, and he would stop and stare and press his nose against the glass, his mouth watering like mad. Many times a day he would see other children taking bars of creamy chocolate out of their pockets and munching on them greedily, and that, of course, was pure torture. Only once a year, on his birthday, did Charlie Bucket ever get to taste a bit of chocolate. The whole family saved up their money for that special occasion, and when the great day arrived, Charlie was always presented with one small chocolate bar to eat all by himself. And each time he received it, on those marvellous birthday mornings, he would place it carefully in a small wooden box that he owned, and treasure it as though it was a bar of solid gold. And for the next few days he would allow himself only to look at it, but never to touch it. Then at last he would stand it no longer. He would peel back a tiny bit of paper wrapping, and at one corner to expose a tiny bit of chocolate, and then he would eat a tiny little nibble, just enough to allow the lovely sweet taste to spread slowly over his tongue. The next day he would take another tiny nibble, and so on and so on, and in this way Charlie would make a sixpenny bar of birthday chocolate last him for more than a month. But I haven't yet told you how one awful thing that tortured little Charlie, the lover of chocolate, more than anything else. This thing, for him, was far, far worse than seeing slabs of chocolate in the shop windows, or watching the other children munching bars of creamy chocolate right in front of him. It was the most terrible, torturing thing you can imagine, and it was this. In the town itself, actually within sight of the house in which Charlie lived, there was an enormous chocolate factory. Just imagine that. And it wasn't simply an ordinary, enormous chocolate factory either. It was the largest and the most famous in the world. It was Wonka's factory, owned by a man called Mr. Willy Wonka, the greatest inventor and maker of chocolates that there has ever been. And what a tremendous, marvellous place it was. It had huge iron gates leading into it, and a high wall surrounding it, and smoke belching from its chimneys, and a strange whizzing sound coming from deep inside it. And outside the walls, for half a mile around in every direction, the air was scented with a heavy smell rich of melting chocolate. Heavy, rich smell of melting chocolate. Twice a day, on his way to and from school, little Charlie Bucket had to walk right past the gates of the factory, and every time he went by, he would begin to walk very, very slowly, and he would hold his nose high in the air and take long, deep sniffs of the gorgeous chocolatey smell all around him. Oh, he loved that smell, and oh, how he wished he could go inside the factory and see what it was like. Chapter 2. Mr. Willy Wonka's Factory. In the evenings, after he had finished his supper of watery cabbage soup, Charlie always went into his room of his 4 grandparents to listen to their stories, and then afterwards say good night. Every one of these old people was over 90. They were as shrivelled as prunes, and as bony as skeletons, and throughout the day, until Charlie made his appearance, they lay huddled in one bed, 2 at either end, with nightcaps on to keep their heads warm, dozing the time away with nothing to do. But as soon as they heard the door opening, and Charlie's voice saying, "Good evening, Grandpa Joe, Grandma Josephine, and Grandpa George, and Grandma Georgina," then all 4 of them would suddenly sit up, and their old wrinkled faces would light up with smiles of pleasure, and the talking would begin. For they loved this little boy. He was the only bright thing in their lives, and his evening visits were something that they looked forward to all day long. Often, Charlie's mother and father would come in as well, and stand by the door, listening to the stories that the old people told. And thus, for perhaps every half an hour a night, this room would become a happy place, and the whole family would forget that it was hungry and poor. One evening, when Charlie went in to see his grandparents, he said to them, "Is it really true that Willy Wonka's chocolate factory is the biggest in the world?" "True?" cried all 4 of them at once. "Of course it's true. Good heavens! Didn't you know that? It's about 50 times bigger than any other." "And is Mr. Willy Wonka really the cleverest chocolate maker in the world?" "My dear boy," said Grandpa Joe, raising himself up a little bit higher on his pillow, Mr. Willy Wonka is the most amazing, the most fantastic, the most extraordinary chocolate maker the world has ever seen. I thought everybody knew that. Well, I knew he was famous, Grandpa Joe, and I knew he was very clever. Clever? Cried the old man. He's more than that. He's a magician with chocolate. He can make anything he wants. Isn't that a fact, my dears? The other three old people nodded their heads slowly up and down and said, absolutely true, just as true as can be. And Grandpa Joe said, you mean to say I've never told you about Mr. Willy Wonka and his factory? Never, answered little Charlie. Good heavens above, I don't know what's the matter with me. Well, I'll tell you now, Grandpa. Will you tell me now, Grandpa Joe, please? I certainly will. Sit down beside me on the bed, my dear, and listen carefully. Grandpa Joe was the oldest of the four grandparents. He was 96 and a half, and that's just about as old as anybody can be. Like all extremely old people, he was delicate and weak, and throughout the day he spoke very little. But in the evenings, when Charlie, his beloved grandson, was in the room, he seemed in some marvellous way to grow quite young again. All his tiredness fell away from him, and he became as eager and as excited as a young boy. Oh, what a man he is, this Mr. Willy Wonka, cried Grandpa Joe. Did you know, for example, that he has invented himself more than 200 new kinds of chocolate bars, each with a different centre, each far sweeter and creamier, and more delicious than anything the other chocolate factories can make? Perfectly true, cried Grandma Josephine, and he sends them all to the four corners of the earth. Isn't that so, Grandpa Joe? It is, my dear, it is, and to all the kings and presidents in the world as well. But it isn't only chocolate bars he makes. Oh, dear me, no. He has some really fantastic inventions up his sleeve. Did you know that he's invented a way of making chocolate ice cream so that it stays cold for hours and hours without being in the refrigerator? You can even leave it lying in the sun all morning on a hot day and it won't go runny. But that's impossible, said little Charlie, staring at his grandfather. Of course it's impossible, Grandpa Joe cried. It's completely absurd, but Mr. Willy Wonka has done it. Quite right, the others agreed, nodding their heads. Mr. Wonka has done it. And then again, Grandpa Joe went on speaking very slowly now so that Charlie wouldn't miss a word. Mr. Wonka can make marshmallows that taste of violets and rich caramels that change colour every 10 seconds as you suck them, and little feathery sweets that melt away deliciously the moment you put them in between your lips. He can make chewing gum that never loses its taste, and sugar balloons that you can blow up to the enormous sizes before you pop them with a pin and gobble them up. And, by a most secret method, he can make lovely bluebirds' eggs with black spots on them, and when you put these in your mouth, it gradually gets smaller and smaller until there's nothing left except a tiny little pink, sugary baby bird sitting on the tip of your tongue. Grandpa Joe paused and ran the point of his tongue slowly over his lips. It makes my mouth water just thinking about it, he said. Mine too, said little Charlie, but please go on. While they were talking, Mr. and Mrs. Bucket, Charlie's mother and father, had come quietly into the room, and now were both standing just inside the door listening. Tell Charlie about that crazy Indian prince, said Grandma Josephine. He'd like to hear that. You mean Prince Pondicherry, said Grandpa Joe, and he began chuckling with laughter. Completely doty, said Grandpa George, but very rich, said Grandma Georgina. What did he do? Asked Charlie eagerly. Listen, said Grandpa Joe, and I'll tell you. Chapter 3. Mr. Wonka and the Indian Prince. Prince Pondicherry wrote a letter to Mr. Willy Wonka, said Grandpa Joe, and asked him to come all the way to India to build him a colossal palace entirely out of chocolate. Did Mr. Wonka do it, Grandpa? He did indeed, and what a palace it was. It was 100 rooms, and everything was made of either dark or light chocolate. The bricks were chocolate, and the cement holding them together was chocolate, and the windows were chocolate, and all the walls and ceilings were made of chocolate. So were the carpets and the pictures, and the furniture and beds, and when you turned the taps in the bathroom, hot chocolate came pouring out. When it was all finished, Mr. Wonka said to Prince Pondicherry, I warn you, though, it won't last very long, so you'd better start eating it right away. Nonsense, shouted the prince. I'm not going to eat my palace. I'm not even going to nibble the staircase or lick the walls. I'm going to live in it. But Mr. Wonka was right, of course, because soon after this there became a very hot day in the boiling sun, and the whole palace began to melt, and then it sank slowly into the ground, and the crazy prince, who was dozing in the living room at the time, woke up to find himself swimming around in a huge brown sticky lake of chocolate. Little Charlie sat very still on the edge of his bed, staring at his grandfather. Charlie's face was bright, and his eyes were stretched so wide you could see the whites all around. "Is all this really true?" he asked, "or are you pulling my leg?" "It's true," cried all four. "Of course it's true. Ask anyone you like." "And I'll tell you something else that's true," said Grandpa Joe. And now he leaned closer to Charlie, and lowered his voice to a soft, secret whisper. "Nobody ever comes out." "Out of where?" asked Charlie. "And nobody ever goes in." "In where?" cried Charlie. "Wonka's factory, of course. Grandpa, what do you mean?" "I mean workers, Charlie." "Workers?" "All factories," said Grandpa Joe, "have workers streaming in and out of the gate every mornings and evenings, except Wonka's." "Have you ever seen a single person going into that place or coming out?" Little Charlie looked slowly around at each of the four old faces, one after the other, and they all looked back at him. They were friendly, smiling faces, but they were also quite serious. There was no sign of joking or leg pulling on any of them. "Well, have you?" asked Grandpa Joe. I really don't know, Grandpa," Charlie stammered. "Whenever I walk past the factory, the gates seem to be closed." "Exactly," said Grandpa Joe. "But there must be people working there." "Not people, Charlie. Not ordinary people, anyway." "Then who?" cried Charlie. "Aha! That's it, you see. That's another of Mr. Willy Wonka's clevernesses. Charlie, my dear," Mrs. Bucket called out from where she was standing by the door, "it's time for bed. That's enough for tonight." "But, Mother, I must hear—" "Tomorrow, my darling." "That's right," said Grandpa Joe. "I'll tell you the rest tomorrow evening." Chapter 4. The Secret Workers. The next evening, Grandpa Joe went on with his story. "You see, Charlie," he said, "not so very long ago there used to be thousands of people working in Mr. Willy Wonka's factory. Then one day, all of a sudden, Mr. Wonka had to ask every single one of them to leave, to go home, never to come back." "But why?" asked Charlie. "Because of spies." "Spies?" "Yes. All the other chocolate makers, you see, had begun to grow jealous of the wonderful sweets that Mr. Wonka was making, and they started sending in spies to steal his secret recipes. The spies took jobs in the Wonka factory, pretending that they were ordinary workers, and while they were there, each one of them found out exactly how a certain special thing was made." "And did they go back to their own factories and tell?" asked Charlie. "They must have," asked Grandpa Joe, "because soon after that, Fickelgruber's factory started making an ice cream that would never melt, even in the hottest sun. Then Mr. Prodnose's factory came out with a chewing gum that never lost its flavour, no matter how much you chewed it. And then Mr. Slugworth's factory began making sugar balloons that you could blow up to huge sizes before you popped them with a pin and gobbled them up. And so on, and so on. And Mr. Willy Wonka tore his beard and shouted, 'This is terrible! I shall be ruined! There are spies everywhere. I shall have to close the factory.'" "But he didn't do that," Charlie said. "Oh, yes, he did. He told all the workers that he was sorry, but they would have to go home. Then he shut the main gates and fastened them with a chain. And suddenly, Wonka's giant chocolate factory became silent and deserted. The chimneys stopped smoking, the machines stopped whirring, and from then on, not a single chocolate or sweet was made. Not a soul went in or out, and even Mr. Willy Wonka himself disappeared completely. Months and months went by. Grandpa Joe went on. But still the factory remained closed, and everybody said, 'Poor Mr. Wonka, he was so nice, and he made such marvellous things, but he's finished now, it's all over.' Then something astonishing happened. One day, early in the morning, thin columns of white smoke were seen to be coming up the tops of the tall chimneys of the factory. People in the town stopped and stared. 'What's going on?' they cried. Someone's lit the furnaces. Mr. Wonka must be opening up again. They ran to the gates, expecting them to see wide open, and Mr. Wonka standing there to welcome his workers back. But no, the great iron gates were still locked and chained as securely as ever, and Mr. Wonka was nowhere to be seen. "But the factory is working," the people shouted. "Listen, you can hear the machines. They're all whirring again, and you can smell the smell of melting chocolate in the air." Grandpa Joe leaned forward and laid a long, bony finger on Charlie's knee and said softly, "But most mysterious of all, Charlie, were the shadows in the windows of the factory. The people standing on the street outside could see small, dark shadows moving about behind the frosted glass windows." "Shadows of whom?" said Charlie quickly. "That's exactly what everybody else wanted to know. The place is full of workers," the people shouted, "but nobody's gone in. The gates are locked. It's crazy. Nobody ever comes out either." "But there was no question at all," said Grandpa Joe, "that the factory was running. And it's gone on running ever since, for at least the last 10 years. What's more, the chocolates and sweets it's been turning out have become more fantastic and delicious all the time. And of course now when Mr. Wonka invents some new and wonderful sweet, neither Mr. Ficklegruber or Mr. Prodners or Mr. Slugworth nor anybody else is able to copy it. No spies can go into the factory to find out how it's made." "But Grandpa, who?" cried Charlie. "Who is Mr. Wonka using to do all the work in the factory?" "Nobody knows, Charlie." "That's absurd. Hasn't someone asked Mr. Wonka?" "Well, nobody sees him anymore. He never comes out. The only things that come out of that place are chocolates and sweets. They come out through a special trap door in the wall, all packed and addressed, and they're picked up every day by the post office trucks." "But, Grandpa, what sort of people are they that work in there?" "My dear boy," said Grandpa Joe, "that's one of the great mysteries of the chocolate-making world. We only know one thing about them. They are very small. The faint shadows that sometimes appear behind the windows, especially late at night when the lights are on, are those of tiny people, people no taller than my knee." "There aren't such people," Charlie said. Just then, Mr. Bucket, Charlie's father, came into the room. He was home from the toothpaste factory and waving an evening newspaper rather excitedly. "Have you heard the news?" he cried. He held up the paper so they could see the huge headline. The headline said, "Wonka Factory to be opened at last to a lucky few." Chapter 5. The Golden Tickets. "You mean people are actually going to be allowed to go inside the factory?" cried Grandpa Joe. "Read us what it says, quickly." "All right," said Mr. Bucket, smoothing out the newspaper. "Listen. I'll read you the article. The Evening Bulletin. Mr. Willy Wonka, the confectionery genius, whom nobody has seen in the last 10 years, sent out the following notice today. I, Willy Wonka, have decided to allow 5 children, just 5, mind you, and no more, to visit my factory this year. These lucky 5 will be shown around personally by me, and they will be allowed to see all the secrets and magic of my factory. Then, at the end of the tour, as a special present, all of them will be given enough chocolates and sweets to last them for the rest of their lives. So watch out for the golden tickets. 5 golden tickets, printed on golden paper, and these 5 golden tickets have been hidden underneath the ordinary wrapping paper of 5 ordinary bars of chocolate. These 5 chocolate bars may be anywhere, in any shop, in any street, in any town, in any country in the world, upon any counter where Wonka sweets are sold. And the 5 lucky finders of these golden tickets are the only ones who will be allowed in to visit my factory and see what it's like now inside. Good luck to you all and happy hunting. Signed, Willy Wonka. The man's doty, muttered Grandma Josephine. He's brilliant, cried Grandpa Joe. He's a magician. Just imagine what will happen now. The whole world will be searching for those golden tickets. Everyone will be buying a Wonka's chocolate bar in the hope of finding one. He will sell more than ever before. Oh, how exciting it would be to find one. And all the chocolates and sweets you could ever eat for the rest of your life for free, said Grandpa George. Just imagine that. They'd have to deliver them in a truck, said Grandma Georgina. It makes me quite ill to think of it, said Grandma Josephine. Nonsense, cried Grandpa Joe. Wouldn't it be something, Charlie, to open a bar of chocolate and see a golden ticket glistening inside? It certainly would, Grandpa, but there isn't a hope, Charlie said sadly. I only get 1 bar per year. You never know, darling, said Grandma Georgina. It's your birthday next week. You have much as of a chance as anybody. I'm afraid that simply isn't true, said Grandpa George. The kids who are going to find the golden tickets are the ones who can afford to buy bars of chocolate every day. Our Charlie gets only 1 a year. There isn't a hope. Chapter 6. The First 2 Finders. The very next day, the first golden ticket was found. The finder was a boy called Augustus Gloop, and Mr. Bucket's evening newspaper carried a large picture of him on the front page. The picture showed a 9-year-old boy who was so enormously fat he looked as though he had been blown up with a powerful pump. Great flabby folds of fat bulged out from every part of his body, and his face was like a monstrous ball of dough with 2 small, greedy, curranty eyes peering out upon the world. The town in which Augustus Gloop lived, the newspaper said, had gone wild with excitement over their hero. Flags were flying from all the windows. Children had been given a holiday from school, and a parade was being organised in the honour of the famous youth. I just knew Augustus would find a golden ticket, his mother had told the newspapers. He eats so many bars of chocolate a day that it was almost impossible for him not to find one. Eating is his hobby, you know. That's all he's interested in. But still, that's better than being a hooligan or shooting off zip guns and things like that in his spare time, isn't it? And what I always say is, he wouldn't go on eating like he does unless he needed nourishment, would he? It's all vitamins anyway. What a thrill it will be for him to visit Mr. Wonka's marvellous factory. We're just as proud as anything. What a revolting woman, said Grandma Josephine. Show you Quentin Blake's picture. There's Mum. And there's Augustus. Funny little drawing, isn't it? And what a repulsive boy, said Grandma Georgina. Only 4 golden tickets left, said Grandpa George. I wonder who'll get those. And now the whole country, indeed the whole world, seemed suddenly to be caught up in a mad chocolate buying spree, everybody searching frantically for those precious remaining tickets. Fully grown women were seen going into sweet shops and buying 10 Wonka bars at a time, then tearing off the wrappers on the spot and peering eagerly underneath for a glint of golden paper. Children were taking hammers and smashing their piggy banks and running out to the shops with handfuls of money. In one city, a famous gangster robbed a bank of £1,000 and spent the whole lot on Wonka bars that same afternoon. And when the police entered his house to arrest him, they found him sitting on the floor amidst mountains of chocolate, ripping off the wrappers with the blade of a long dagger. In far-off Russia, a woman called Charlotte Roos claimed to have found the second ticket, but it turned out to be a clever fake. The famous English scientist, Professor Fullbody, invented a machine which would tell you at once, without opening the wrapper of a bar of chocolate, whether or not a gold ticket was hidden underneath it. The machine had a mechanical arm that shot out with tremendous force and grabbed hold of anything that had the slightest bit of gold inside it. And for a moment it looked like the answer to everything. But unfortunately, while the professor was showing off to the machine to the public, at the sweet counter of a large department store, the mechanical arm shot out and made a grab for the gold filling in the back tooth of a duchess who was standing nearby. There was an ugly scene, and the machine was smashed by the crowd. Suddenly, on the day before Charlie Bucket's birthday, the newspapers announced that the second golden ticket had been found. The lucky person was a small girl called Veruca Salt, who lived with her rich parents in a great city far away. Once again, Mr. Bucket's evening newspaper carried a big picture of the finder. She was sitting between her beaming father and mother in the living room of their house, waving the golden ticket above her head and grinning from ear to ear. Veruca's father, Mr. Salt, had eagerly explained to the newspapermen exactly how the ticket was found. You see, boys, he had said, as soon as my little girl told me that she had simply had to have one of those golden tickets, I went out into the town and started buying up all the Wonka bars I could lay my hands on. Thousands of them. I must have bought hundreds of thousands. Then I had them loaded onto trunks and sent them directly to my factory. I'm on the peanut business, you see, and I've got about 100 women working for me over at my place, shelling peanuts for roasting and salting. That's what they do all day long, those women. They sit there shelling peanuts. So I says to them, "Okay, girls," I says, "from now on you can stop shelling peanuts and start shelling the wrappers off these chocolate bars instead." And they did. I had every worker in the place yanking the paper off those bars of chocolate full speed ahead from morning till night. But 3 days went by and we still had no luck. Oh, it was terrible. My little Veruca got more and more upset each day. And every time I went home, she would scream at me, "Where's my golden ticket? I want my golden ticket." And she would lie for hours on the floor, kicking and yelling in the most disturbing way. Well, I just hated to see my little girl feeling unhappy like that, so I vowed to keep up the search until I got her what she wanted. Then suddenly, on the evening of the 4th day, one of my woman workers yelled, "I've got it! Golden ticket!" And I said, "Give it to me, quick!" And she did. And I rushed it home and gave it to my darling Veruca. And now she's all smiles, and we have a happy home once again. "That's even worse than the fat boy," said Grandma Josephine. "She really needs a good spanking," said Grandma Georgina. "I don't think the girl's father played it quite fair, Grandpa, do you?" Charlie murmured. "He spoils her," Grandpa Joe said, "and no good can ever come from spoiling a child like that. Charlie, you mark my words." "Come to bed, my darling," said Charlie's mother. "Tomorrow's your birthday, don't forget that. So I expect you'll be up early to open your present." "A Wonka chocolate bar?" cried Charlie. "Is it a Wonka chocolate bar, isn't it?" "Yes, my love," his mother said. "Of course it is." "Oh, wouldn't it be wonderful if I found the 3rd golden ticket inside?" Charlie said. "Bring it in here when you get it," Grandpa Joe said. "Then we can all watch you taking off the wrapper." And there we have it. We are up to chapter 7, Charlie